be in God's house. Amen. I enjoy the Psalms. I may not preach on them every Sunday night, but I enjoy them. You get a lot of history. You get a lot of personal help out of the book of Psalms. These were written as worship and praise unto God, also for the encouragement and sometimes the admonition of the Lord to the Jewish nation. And I thank the Lord for them. Amen. I'm glad God has exactly what we need when we need it. He's always got that. Get to the 53rd Psalm. It's one of the Psalms of David, written by David. Now, it gives a little introduction if you've got Scofield Bible. If you don't, I'm just going to give it to it. But Psalm 52 describes a time in David's life when he was hiding from Saul. David had the same kind of problems we do. Matter of fact, one time he even said, I believe now that Saul's going to kill me, when God had anointed him to be king over Israel, and he hadn't got to sit on that throne yet. And he just simply said, paraphrasing, one of these days Saul will kill me. He'll catch me. So he's out hiding from him. And what he does, that when they left, they had to leave with basically nothing in their hand, kind of like the Ukrainian people. When that war started over there, listen, they just carried what little they could carry on their back and in backpacks and things of that nature. And they started a mass exodus toward Poland. Tried to get out of there. David and his men, matter of fact, he had several hundred men with him. They needed food, they needed weapons, they needed quite a few things. So what he did, they went to the tabernacle of the congregation. The tabernacle of the congregation was in a place called Kirjath Jearim. It remained there actually 20 years. You remember when the Philistines sent that thing back on a cart and came back, and when they opened up the ark itself, and God didn't, he just set them on fire. They sent it back to Israel. Israel, they opened it up, looked in, God got them too, and then finally they was driving a brand new cart and it stumbled. They were trying to do the same thing the Philistines were, and God struck one of the men dead, so they just parked that thing. And for 20 years that ark stayed in a man's house, stayed in his property for 20 years, the ark of God. So David won't bring that back until after Saul's gone and David is the king of Israel. So he went to that place where that ark was, and he went there for a reason. He knew that they could get some food and get help there. They had a high priest by the name of Ahimelech. He knew them, had a lot of priests there, so they fed a lot of people. When they went there, they gave him the showbread that came off of the table of showbread. They gave that to him. What that was for the priest to devour. They put those fresh loaves on there, and then at the end of the day they took them off. They were for the priesthood. So they gave it to him and his men, and then also he asked them if they had any weapons, and Ahimelech told him, we have Goliath's sword. David said there's none like it. So Ahimelech gave him Goliath's sword. I often said that David was not a little small, ruddy-faced weakling. That sword was like none other. That was made to fit the hand of a giant. And he took that and wielded that sword just like Goliath did. But he took that. Well, while they were there getting all this, getting the food and weaponry, a man showed up or was already there. The Bible doesn't, I don't think, say if he was already there, just came there. His name was Doeg, D-O-E-G. He was the chief of the men of the herdsmen over Saul's herds and everything. He was a man of great power and authority, and he saw what Ahimelech did. So what he did, he went back to Saul and he told Saul what Ahimelech and the priests did. So they sent for Ahimelech and 85 priests and brought them to Saul, and Saul had them put to death. Matter of fact, Doeg fell on them with a sword and killed 85 priests that day. So what we find is this psalm was written about that. Now as we get into it, I think we're going to see the history of it. But he said in verse number 1, why boasteth thou thyself in mischief, O mighty man? Now he's talking to Doeg. Doeg was a warrior. He was a very strong man. He was a very powerful man. He fell on these priests that could not help themselves. They didn't bear any weapons and killed 85 of God's men in one day. Now, notice what he said. Why boastest thou thyself in mischief, O mighty man? The goodness of God endureth continually. Now, what he was talking about here, Doeg was a mighty man, but he was a mighty man because of the blessings of God. You know, a lot of times we think that we deserve what we've got, we've earned our way, but God allowed him to be put in this place because Saul wasn't always a bad king. And this man was under him when he was not a bad king, and God elevated him up. So when they're writing here, he said, why boastest thou thyself in mischief? Evidently, after they had killed these priests, Doeg had gone around bragging about getting the job done. He thought he had won some points, so to speak, with King Saul. He went around bragging on killing these unarmed men. So this is written about him and then to the children of Israel at the end of it. So I want to read it. Why boastest thou thyself in mischief, O mighty man? The goodness of God endureth continually. Thy tongue deviseth mischiefs like a sharp razor working deceitfully. Thou lovest evil more than good, and lying rather than to speak righteousness, Selah. That word Selah just simply means meditate or think on these things. When you see that at the end of a verse, I want you to think about it, so I'm going to read that verse again. Thou lovest evil more than good, and lying rather than to speak righteousness. Thou lovest all devouring words, O thou deceitful tongue. God shall likewise destroy thee forever. He shall take thee away and pluck thee out of thy dwelling place and root thee out of the land of living, Selah. The righteous also shall see and fear and shall laugh at him. Lo, this is the man that made not God his strength, but trusted in the abundance of his riches and strengthened himself in his wickedness. But I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. I will praise thee forever because thou hast done it, and I will wait on thy name, for it is good before thy saints. So we find him talking to Doeg in part of this, then talking about Doeg and what God's going to do in part of it, and then you find at the end of it, David talking about himself because he's the victim. So I want to look at just a few moments. I want to break this down into three parts. Verses 1 through 4, we find the wickedness of a deceitful tongue. In verses 5 through 7, we find the impending judgment of God upon this individual that made God not his strength. He bragged about the mischief that he had done and wanted to profit by it. And he said, God's going to take care of you in time. And by the way, God will take care in time. Then verses 8 and 9, we find David's protection from the power of that tongue and from the evil that Doeg wanted to do with him. I want to deal tonight with the tongue just for a few minutes out of here, because that's what this is all about. You've got a man that did a terrible thing and bragged about it. A powerful man that took advantage of these men of God and killed them, these innocent men. All they did, listen, they weren't on anybody's side, but all Israel loved David. When David came to Ahimelech had no problem at all with feeding him. He had no problem at all taking care of his physical needs, and he had no problem at all of giving him Goliath's sword so that he would at least be armed. He'd have a chance in battle. So as he writes this to them, we find he talks about a tongue. Now I want to deal with the last part first, and then we'll come back. In verse 9, we find the devotion of the saved. This is the end of it. David said, I'll praise thee forever because thou hast done it. What's he talking about? He's talking about the justice of God on the enemies of God. And I'm going to say tonight that, listen, pray for your enemies. Pray for those that despitefully use you. Pray for those, feed those that are hungry. If you see your neighbor having a problem and he's been an enemy of you, if you can help him in any way, you ought to go help that man. You'd be surprised what it'll do with it. But we find the praise in verse number 9 of David. He said, I'm going to praise you forever. Why? Because thou hast done it, and I will wait on thy name, for it is good before thy saints. Verse number 8, we find the defense of the saved. He said, but I'm like a green olive tree in the house of God. But he said, I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. He's praising God in verse 9 because his faith is in the Lord in verse number 8. When Doeg did this, he just simply put his trust in God. Verse 6 through 7, we find the derision of the saved. It said, the righteous also shall see and fear and shall laugh at him. One of these days, I've often said that God laughs last. I don't know about you, with kids, we used to make this statement, he who laughs last laughs best. Anybody ever heard that statement before? If you get that last, to laugh over them. Listen, God's people one of these days, and I'm not talking about we're going to enjoy what takes place, but we're going to laugh because God's going to take things in hand in the end of this thing. He's going to straighten this thing up in this world. Now, I'm not long to get out here. We were talking about that this afternoon, be it by death or be it by the rapture of the church. They asked Dr. Sightler one time which he preferred, to die or to go in a rapture. I remember Dr. Sightler's statement. He said, if I go in the rapture, I won't have to die. But he said, if I go by death, then I get to experience heaven before that and the joys of heaven with the Lord a little bit earlier than everybody else. And he said, I'm kind of in a strait betwixt the two. God's going to take care of it, but look at what he said. The righteous shall see it and fear and shall laugh. Lo, this man that made not God his strength. He trusted in the abundance of his riches and strengthened himself in wickedness. That God is going to judge, and one day we'll laugh. If you back up to verse number 5, he said, God shall likewise destroy thee forever. He'll take thee away and pluck thee out of thy dwelling place and root thee out of the land of the living. Selah. God one of these days is going to take care, just like he did with Doeg. He said, thou lovest all devouring words, O thou deceitful tongue. When you back up to verses 2 and 3, especially in verse number 4, but go to verse number 2. Thy tongue deviseth mischiefs like a sharp razor working deceitfully. Thou lovest evil more than good, and lying rather than speaking righteousness. Selah. Thou lovest all devouring words, O thou deceitful tongue. We find several descriptions in here of the tongue. He talks about, verse number 2, the devising tongue. I thought about Doeg, the mischievous. The man who made God not his strength, but when he planned to profit by the death of these men that were in the tabernacle, these priests. He decided he would profit by them. He had a devising tongue. Then he had a deceptive tongue. Over in verse number 3, he called him, thou lovest evil more than good, and lying rather than to speak righteousness. Evidently what he did, while one to Saul, he lied about what he saw. I think he made Ahimelech look worse than Ahimelech was. Somebody said one time, history's always written by the survivors. Well, what he did was he made it look better. He embellished the story that he saw before Saul to the point that it angered him to the point that he called those priests and said they would be put to death. So we find that lying tongue. Then we find a devouring tongue in verse number 4. Thou lovest all devouring words. He was a hateful man. And then a deceitful tongue in verse 4. O thou deceitful tongue. And then a destroying tongue in verse number 5. Now I want to look at the tongue a few minutes tonight. Why? The tongue's a dangerous thing. God gave everybody a tongue. Everybody here got a tongue tonight. Everybody here got 2 ears. My dad always said God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth, boy. He said that ought to tell you something. We used to say, keep your words short and sweet, for you never know which ones you'll eat. Silence Barbara has actually two life verses. One of those is found in Isaiah 26:3. Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed upon thee, because he trusteth in thee. But the other one is found in Proverbs chapter number 21 and verse number 23, where he talked about the tongue. Whoso keepeth his mouth and tongue keepeth his soul from troubles. She's learned a long time ago. I thank God tonight I've got a quiet wife. Now, she's not quiet at home. Matter of fact, the doctor the other day told her to quit talking. He did. He said, quit talking, go straight. Every time she'd open her mouth, I said, doctor said, shut up, honey. That's the only time I can use those words, shut up. You don't want to use those words in that kind of tone of voice. But we laughed about it. Miss Joan called me on the phone. She was losing her voice. She said, I'm getting laryngitis. I said, I'm going to tell you what advice the doctor gave to Miss Barbara. She said, what's that? I said, Miss Joan, you're talking too much. And she just laughed, and she said, well, I've got to talk too much. She said, I have to repeat everything to Harold 2 or 3 times in order to get him to do what he needs to do. But I laughed at her. When Miss Jones gets you on the telephone, you're going to be there for a little while. So we laughed about that. But I'm talking about the tongue. It's a dangerous thing that we've got in our mouth. We find a man here that put that tongue to use in the wrong way, and it brought the judgment of God. And I still believe that the tongue, the Bible said that there's death and life in the power of the tongue. How strong is that tongue? I heard a story one time, and I don't think he actually did it. I think it was just a metaphor that he used. But at the same time, a man said that a young man left the church, went all over town talking bad about him. Later, the young man got right with the Lord and came back to the church, and he went into the pastor's office and said, I want to apologize to you, and I want to make this thing right. And the pastor said, I accept your apology, no problem, but it's hard to make it right. He said, well, what do I have to do to make it right? He said, I want you to ride with me. You get in the back of the truck. I want you to cut a pillow with feathers in it and cut it open, and I'm going to drive across town, and you just throw out hands full of feathers all the way across town. And when he did that, the young man said, how did that help? He said, it didn't help. He said, now I want you to go back and pick them all up. So we find the power of that tongue tonight. I have a problem with my tongue. I'm a man of many words, and the Bible said in the book of Proverbs, in a multitude of words there wanteth not for sin. The more we say, that's why over in James chapter number 3, which is what's called a full mention principle of Bible interpretation, verses 1 through 10, he deals with that tongue set on fire in hell. But he said, be not many masters. And he talks about with that position of being many masters. In other words, you're good at this, and you're good at that, and you're good at this. He said, with that goes the greater condemnation. And he began talking about that tongue. As a pastor, I've got to be careful because I use a multitude of words. That's why I pray quite a bit and ask God to do as the psalmist. The psalmist said to set a guard at the gate of his lips that he might not sin against God. And I pray this way, Lord, watch my mouth and guard my mouth so that I won't say anything hurtful and harmful, and yet give me the boldness and liberty to say everything that is needful. So you've got to hold a balance in your life. I believe one of the greatest enemies of the local church is a tongue. Everybody's got one, and boy, I'll tell you what, sometimes you get in trouble. They used to say back home, and somebody asked about these old sayings, I've got a bunch of them. Listen, country people had a lot of common sense or horse sense. And my daddy always said, boy, don't ever leave your tongue in gear when your brain's idling. He said, if your brain not working, keep your mouth shut. The less words you say, the less possibility there is to say something harmful or hurtful to somebody else, or to say something that's wrong. Pastors never lie. They just evangelistically speak from the pulpit, all right? They embellish a little bit, and I do that sometimes as a joke. You know, I make things a little bit, just get you laughing, get your mind on a certain thing or off to something else on the other end of there. Brother Harold used to say that every man was allowed one little tea-waddy a day. He always called a lie, a white lie, a tea-waddy. And he said, you're allowed one tea-waddy a day. You can get away with that one, all right. But after that, you're going to be accountable for what you say. The tongue tonight, the devilishness, that dangerous thing that we have, death and life are in the power of the tongue. Listen to what he said in Proverbs 18. And they that love it, the power of the tongue, shall eat the fruit thereof. We listen to politicians today say all of this stuff, and then they get Pinocchios. Everybody knows what a Pinocchio is, right? Every time Pinocchio lied, his nose would come out about 6 or 8 inches or whatever. And they get Pinocchios. Why? Well, now they just say that's not what he meant to say, all right? And then they start explaining away what people meant. No, they say what they say. The more they speak, the worse it is. In the tongue, hey, I'm talking about in the church. Hey, you could have a divisive tongue tonight. You know, over in Proverbs, these 6 things doth God hate. He gives 6 things God hates. Let me read them. A proud look, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that deviseth wicked imaginations, feet that be swift in running to mischief, a false witness that speaketh lies. Listen to the 7th one. He said this about the 7th. Yea, 7 are an abomination unto the Lord. He that soweth discord among brethren. God help us tonight never to sow discord. With me preaching on the, I want you to understand nobody's saying anything to anybody wrong, all right? I don't know of anything going on tonight. I like preaching through the Word of God because you're going to deal with everything at one time or the other. I think the last time I preached on the tongue was about 2007. Been a long time. Well, it can't be that long because I preached through the book of James, didn't I? So I need to go back and refurbish that just a little bit. But a divisive or a divisive tongue. They pronounce these things different ways. I got tickled the other day. I watched a little thing on a factory over in England, and they kept talking about vitamins. Vitamins. I kept saying vitamins. They said vitamins. I got tickled to the English people in the way they pronounce it. A divisive tongue. A tongue that causes discord to form within the house of God. Listen, if you've got something to say about me, say it to me. We're all friends there. You just come to my house, call me. I'll come over to your house. I'll meet you at church. We'll sit down. We'll talk all day long. And listen, when it's all over with, we'll be best friends when we walk out the door. And that's just the way I am. But listen, when you get into the house of God, you've got to be careful with a dividing tongue or a divisive tongue. Then a gossiping tongue, found in Proverbs 26:20. Where no wood is, there the fire goeth out. Sometimes people will call you, and if you're not careful, you'll spread what they said, not knowing if it's right or wrong. I hate Facebook to a huge degree. I know a lot of people just stay on it all the time. I don't stay on it. I use it as a tool, one to show you my deer in case you're hungry. And then a few things like that. As far as just going down and scrolling down, say, you know, I unfollow most people outside the church. Now, I haven't unfollowed any of you. But I accept friend requests, and when I accept that request, I automatically unfollow them. That way, what they put on their Facebook page does not show up on mine, because I'm real particular about what gets on my Facebook page. I use that as a tool. I don't like any cursing. I don't like any off-color stuff on there. When they do that automatically, listen, I'll just nail them. I'll just go ahead and I won't receive their junk anymore. I'm talking about a gossiping tongue. Now listen what he said. Where no wood is, there the fire goeth out. When somebody tells you something, it's like Facebook. If Facebook said it, it's right, right? These people share this garbage on Facebook. You can misprove about 95% of what they put on there in about a minute flat. You can disprove what they said. What they said in there was not right. They just thought it sounded good and shared somebody else. You'd be surprised how many Christian people share stuff without even reading what they're sharing. I saw something that looked good the other day, and I looked back, and it had 175 shares, and I forgot how many K comments. That K means thousands. That means if I make a comment, you got saved, you got lost, you got conservative, you've got liberal, you've got everything in the world out there that are making comments on what other people are making comments on. I'm careful about what I share. I'm talking about gossiping. But where no wood is, if there's no talebearer, the strife ceases. How do you put a fire out? You pull the logs out of it. By the way, you save your logs. If you got an outside fire, just pull the logs back out of the fire and they'll go out, and then actually you've got charcoal. When you get burnt wood like that, it's actually charcoal, and it's just about like lighter. You can use that to light it back up. What I'll do is I'll put some wood down, start a little fire in the middle, and put that burnt wood on top, and immediately, buddy, she starts to blaze up. I'm talking about a gossiping tongue. Be careful about spreading stuff. Then you've got a backbiting tongue. Psalms chapter 15. The Bible said, who shall dwell in thy holy hill? He that walketh uprightly, worketh righteousness, speaketh the truth in his heart, he that backbiteth not with his tongue. So we find a backbiting tongue. What's a backbiting tongue? It's when you talk about somebody behind their back. Better be careful what you say behind somebody's back, because a lot of times it gets around to the front. The Bible said if you talk evil of the king, a little bird will tell him in his bedroom. I've got a lot of eyes and ears in the church, and I thank God for that. One thing I want the people to do is help me in the pulpit. I can't see everything. I can't hear everything. I can't be every place. And I'm not talking about in a critical way. But when they hear something that I need to know, then they need to call me and tell me, Pastor, is there something I'm not trying to gossip, just something I think you need to know that's out there. And that kind of gives me a little bit of help. You know, sometimes the pastor's like the husband. He's the last one to know. Sometimes I'm the last one to get information. If you're not careful, people say, well, I really don't want to talk to the preacher about it. He's the one you need to talk to about it. That's the one you need to talk about. So not talk about, talk to about. Amen. And then over in 3 John, you get the prating tongue. O Diotrephes, loveth to have the preeminence among them, receiveth is not. That Diotrephes was a mess. He hated John. He hated those in authority. He spoke evil of them. Matter of fact, he would not receive them when they came around him. He was just one of these guys like to have the preeminence. Be careful with people who like to be seen. Be careful with people, if they've got to have a red mat rolled out to them at that front door, you better be careful. I'm very careful when new people come in the church and then all of a sudden they're heading everything up. I'm careful of that. Why? I think you need to watch them for a little while. I'm not saying not let them get involved, but hey, some people like to have the preeminence. And what they do, they'll prey on small churches. Because in small churches, it's easier to get up to the apex of the authority in a small church than it is. If they go to a church that's got 2,000, 3,000 people, they just kind of blend into the crowd out there, and nobody knows anything about them. So what happens is sometimes they'll come, and we've had a few in the past, not many, but we've had a few Diotrephes. But what they did, they spoke against the men of God with a prating tongue. That prating tongue said that he wouldn't receive the brethren, forbidding them that would, casteth them out of a church, malicious words, not content therewith. Be careful with a prating tongue. And then you've got a deceitful tongue. Over in Psalm 50, verse 19, thou givest thy mouth to evil, and thy tongue frameth deceit. You frame something that you're proud of. I don't frame a lot of pictures, but some pictures we do frame. We've got some old frames in our house. We've got a gold frame of Barbara when she was about what, 18 months old, 2 years old. One of the most beautiful little girls you ever saw in your life. You see that? It's an old-fashioned. It's got a whole lot of design to that. It's not square. It's square on one side. It's rounded. Just a beautiful, beautiful frame. We've got one over our bed of Barbara and I, and it's got our engagement picture. We went together from 62 to 68. 68, we actually got engaged to be married. Got married in 1969. That old black frame, I don't want to paint it. It's an old black frame that my dad had down in the basement of his house in his workshop, and had my picture and Barbara's picture in that frame down there. You frame things that are important to you. He talks about framing deceit. A deceitful tongue, thy tongue frameth it, puts importance on things that he knows are not right. Then you got a murmuring tongue, Acts 6:11. And I'm almost through. The Bible talked about there was a murmuring among the Grecians against the Hebrews because their widows were neglected in the daily ministration. Now, they got to talking in groups about what was going on that they didn't like. I'm careful about what I say about things that I don't like. I try to be very careful about that because I'm a man and I don't like a whole lot of things. That's just who I am. It's what I've always been. I've been one of these just staunch in where I am. If I believe something, I believe it with all my heart. I'm not halfway in what I believe, and I'm real staunch with it. A murmuring tongue. If I've ever got anything to say to you, I'll come to you. I won't say it behind your back. I'll just come say it, and we'll sit down and talk about it. Murmuring. Just murmuring. Boy, the children of Israel were a murmuring people. And the last one I want to deal with very quickly is the discouraging tongue. Over in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 28, he said, our brethren have discouraged our hearts, saying that the people is greater and taller than we, and the cities are great and walled up to heaven, and moreover, we've seen the son of the Anakims there. We find a discouraging tongue. Somebody, listen, be upbeat. Everybody gets down, right? How many have discouraging day? I think everybody has. If you don't, you're not human. You're just not. If you don't ever have a discouraging day, you're living far above humanly speaking out here. Listen, I've got days sometimes I get up and I'm discouraged and I don't even know why. That's where you use your prayer closet. You use the Word of God to get over that. You get up and all of a sudden, hey, Barbara always said you get up on the wrong side of the bed. I don't know what the right side of the bed is unless I've got her house shoes on. If I put her house shoes on, I got up on the wrong side of the bed. Sometimes you get that way. He's talking about a discouraging tongue. Be careful not to discourage people. They get enough of that out here in this world. Our job is to encourage one another. And I'm not talking about not bearing and sharing burdens. I think you need to have people to bear and to share your burdens with. I think it's a good thing. I've got some men that I call. Boy, one of my favorite men in all this world is Tom Holbrooks. I don't see Tom much anymore. He's pastoring up in Hendersonville, been up there several years, doing a good job up there, and thank God. He keeps saying we're going to meet about halfway for dinner. I guess that means we're going Dutch, right? Everybody remember John Watts. We went out to eat with John Watts one night, and we got where we was going, and he said, "Preacher, I'm sorry." He said, "I left my billfold at home." I said, "Ain't no problem, John." I said, "I got this. I paid for his and Dean's and mine and Barry, and I don't have any problem doing that." Wasn't long after that, we was going up the road going to eat at the same place, and John, I forgot my billfold. I said, "Now we're going back and getting it, John." That one ain't going to work twice. Now, what's he talking about here? He's talking about a man that boasted in his mischief. He was a man that was blessed of God. You know, if he had just kept his mouth shut and stayed out, that was between Saul and David. It wasn't between Doeg and David. It wasn't between Doeg and Ahimelech. If he just kept his mouth shut, you know what? He would have lived a whole lot better life. Now, I don't see where they killed him or anything else. God was good to him, but I find that he chastened him. We got to be careful tonight with our mouth. He said, the goodness of God endureth continually. Listen, God's good to us all the time. But then God expects us to be good one to another. He expects us to do that. One of these days I'll preach on goodness and gentleness and the rest of that crowd as we come down to it. But the goodness of God, God's good to us. I need to learn to put a bridle in my mouth, a bit. You turn a horse's head when he's heady. You turn his head with a bit. Sometimes you got to put a cutting bit in. And a lot of people are not familiar with that cutting bit. Sometimes you get a horse that's heady. He'll fight a bit. You pull that bit, you may pull his head, but you're not going to pull him around because he's heady. That's why he used that over in 2 Timothy chapter 3 when he was talking about these people having a form of godliness. One of the things he said about them, that they were heady. You got to use a cutting bit. Sometimes we've got to let God just put a bit in our mouth and us bite down on it. And sometimes the best words that you'll ever say are the ones that you never said to start with. Amen. Be careful of your tongue. Let's stand tonight. A lot of these Psalms are going to be a lot of teaching. I don't know what happened to Doeg, but according to the Psalms, God punished him for what he did. I don't know what he did with